Tactical Talk. This is Zain, the United Nations and Arab League envoy to Syria, put out an estimate of more than 400,000 that had died in the Syrian war. UNICEF reported that over 500 children had died by early as February 2012. More than 5 million men, women, and children have now fled the Syrian war. This is one of the largest refugee crises since World War II. Today, the guest of our show is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He is a senior British journalist and also the founder and editor of the political magazine Politics First. Welcome to our show, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Thank you very much for having invited me on.
Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, let's get to the first question. How many countries are currently or have been involved in the Syrian conflict?
Well, there are a number of international players which are involved in the Syrian conflict, some of whom are involved legally, some of whom are involved illegally, and that is an extremely important distinction to make. Let's take the countries which are involved legally, and when I say legally, they have been invited to be involved by the Syrian government, which in accordance with international law, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, is the only legal authority in Syria. And those countries are Russia and Iran. And Russia and Iran have involved themselves in the conflict in Syria with the consent of the Syrian government to ensure that the Syrian government prevails in its war with Islamist Wahhabist terrorism. Now, turning to the countries which are involved in the Syrian conflict illegally, they are America, Britain, France, and those countries are assisting the various Islamist Wahhabist terrorist groups operating in Syria with the objective of overthrowing the Syrian government.
Which country is taking which side, and what are both of their narratives?
Well, Russia and Iran are fighting alongside the Syrian military in order to defeat terrorism in Syria, because a Syria which is defeated by terrorism will pose not just increased threat to the Middle East and North Africa from terrorism, but also it will pose a very serious threat to the national security of both Russia and Iran. So the Russians and the Iranians are supporting the Syrian government to ensure the defeat of terrorism in that country, whereas the Americans, the British, the French are assisting the numerous terrorist groups in Syria in order to overthrow the Syrian government. Now, why are the Americans and their allies and their regional allies attempting to overthrow the Syrian government? For a number of reasons. The Americans understand that by overthrowing the Syrian government and installing a pro-Western government in Damascus, Russia's influence and power in the Middle East would come to an end. Secondly, by removing the Syrian government, which has very good ties to Iran, that would dent Iran's influence and power in the Middle East. Thirdly, by removing the Syrian government, Israel would lose its arch enemy. And fourthly, Hezbollah would become a spent force with the overthrow of the Syrian government. And it's very important to establish this point clearly to people watching this interview, that the Americans and the British and the French have been supporting almost from day one terrorist groups in Syria. The same terrorists, ideologically speaking, who are responsible for terrorist attacks across the world.
Dr. Papadopoulos, the U.S. claimed to be supporting moderate rebels. Which groups do they mean by that?
Well, of course, the Americans claim to be supporting moderate forces, freedom fighters in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Soviet army. Who were they supporting? They were supporting elements of the Mujahideen, such as Osama bin Laden, and we know that Osama bin Laden was no moderate. The Americans naturally are going to say to their domestic audience and to people around the world that they are supporting, in quotation marks, moderate forces. But of course, there are no moderate forces in Syria, or indeed the only moderate force is the Syrian Arab Army, which is secular, which is multicultural, and is comprised of all the different religious and ethnic groups in Syria. So there are Shia in the Syrian army, there are Sunni, there are Druze, there are Christians, there are Armenians, etc., etc. When the Americans say publicly that they are supporting the so-called Free Syrian Army, well, the so-called Free Syrian Army is an Islamist Wahhabist terrorist group. And let's just take one example. Some years ago, the town of Malula, an ancient town not far from Damascus, whose inhabitants speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ, this beautiful, ancient, wonderful town was conquered in a joint operation by the Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra. And of course, al-Nusra is affiliated to Al-Qaeda. Now, I'm very confident and happy to say that the Americans have also been supporting al-Nusra, but publicly they don't say that. But the Americans do say they're publicly supporting the so-called Free Syrian Army, and so do the British, and so do the Turks, etc., etc. Well, if the Free Syrian Army was moderate, why was it working? Why was it fighting hand in hand with Al-Qaeda in Malula? Why has it been fighting hand in hand with al-Nusra up and down Syria? That is a question to put to American policymakers, and of course they won't be able to answer it.
ISIS is claimed to be the biggest terrorist threat in Syria at the moment. How weak has it become, and do you see it being completely destroyed and eradicated soon?
Well, on the battlefield, ISIS, this repugnant terrorist group, is no longer the force that it once was. ISIS is on the verge of an all-out defeat in Syria. It doesn't control much territory in Syria anymore, and thank goodness for that. And we should be extremely grateful to the Syrian military, to the Russian military, and of course to the Iranian military for having destroyed, or almost destroyed, ISIS in Syria. Now, defeating the perverse ideology of ISIS, not just in Syria, but across the world, will of course be a completely different battle. So ISIS is no longer the force it once was in Syria. I would say that it is only a matter of time, a short matter of time, until ISIS is completely eradicated in Syria, and then the Syrian military and the Russian military and the Iranian military will focus their attention on the north, the northern part of Syria, where of course you have these other terrorist groups, al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army. And al-Nusra, in my opinion, in my estimation, is more powerful than the Free Syrian Army. But staying on the subject of ISIS, I would like to see an investigation by the United Nations, sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, an independent investigation into who equipped ISIS, who trained ISIS, who financed ISIS, and who purchased ISIS oil. Because ISIS, in its heyday, was a formidable fighting machine. How did it become a formidable fighting machine? It must have been receiving support from some extremely powerful countries in the world. And we know who those countries are. We know that the Americans and the British were supporting ISIS. Perhaps, just perhaps, they've started to create a distance between themselves and ISIS because they know that ISIS is going to be destroyed very soon in Syria. But nonetheless, the world needs to know who armed ISIS, who trained ISIS, who financed ISIS, and who purchased oil from ISIS. We need to know that.
Dr. Papadopoulos, let's get to the last question. Numerous countries have jumped into the Syrian conflict. As we've discussed earlier, how do you see this conflict coming to an end? Will it come to an end? As an intellectual, what is the solution to the Syrian conflict, in your opinion?
Well, regrettably, and it pains me to say this, and I have said this from day one of the conflict back in 2011, that the only solution is a military one, and I have been proved correct. I wish there had been a diplomatic solution. I wish this awful conflict would have come to an end years ago and would have saved the lives of thousands of people, but that wasn't to be, and that is the fault of the Americans and the British and their regional allies. So I think looking at a map of modern day Syria in terms of the battlefield situation, it's very evident that the Syrian military is going to be victorious once ISIS is fully defeated in the east of the country, once it is defeated in the south, and once the other terrorist groups are defeated in the south, then the Syrian military will focus its attention on the northwest in Syria, where al-Nusra is and the so-called Free Syrian Army is. And once those forces are defeated, then of course Damascus will have to sit down and talk with the Kurds, as of course they are doing at the moment, and they have been doing for some time. The Kurds, understandably, have been taking help from anyone who would offer it to them. So they've been receiving help from the Americans, but they've also been receiving help from the Russians, and they've also been receiving help from the Syrian government. And importantly, the Kurds in Syria have said that they do not want an independent homeland forged from Syrian territory, but they do want some sort of autonomy from Damascus. And I believe that Damascus will probably have to consent to that to some extent. So I believe that sooner or later, and I hope sooner, the conflict will be over, and then the Syrian government and Kurdish representatives will be able to sit down and discuss what do they do with the parts of Syria which are being controlled at the moment by Kurdish forces. But it is very important to make sure that the Americans and the Turks do not have one bit of presence in Syria. The Syrian government will not tolerate that, the Russian government won't tolerate that, and the Iranian government won't tolerate that. I believe the American and Turkish presence in the north of Syria is at the moment very precarious. I do believe that the Turks, once the Syrian military has liberated that territory close to the Turkish border, the Turkish government will not want to have a military confrontation with the Syrians. It's just not in their interests. What will they get out of it? The Americans, of course, have soldiers, in particular Marines, in those parts of Syria which are controlled by the Kurds. And I believe that the Americans will also withdraw their soldiers from Syria. I think the Americans, for at least a year and a half now, following the tangible results of the Russian military intervention in Syria, understand that their objective of trying to overthrow the Syrian government has failed, and failed abysmally. Yes, they have a plan B to keep a presence in the north of the country to try and potentially partition it, but I just do not believe that will happen. I believe that Syria will emerge from this conflict unified, scarred, of course, but I hope that Syria will get back to being one of the safest countries in the world, and Syria will go down in history as having done an enormous service to mankind and civilization by having defeated the scourge of Islamist Wahhabist terrorism, which is a threat to every single person in the world, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jew alike.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much again for inviting me on. I'm grateful.
This was Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, the editor and founder of Politics First, a British politics magazine. We were discussing what is really happening in Syria. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain. Take care and goodbye.